With the destruction of his village and losing his parents, a young man goes off on a quest of revenge. That's, of course, the story of Conan the Barbarian. We'll be looking at the 1982 original film with Arnold Schwarzenegger and the 2011 starring Jason Momoa. I'm John Jame Dan Edmonds.
Hello there.
With some of these sword and sorcery kind of films is the basic idea of, we've talked about revenge in many different ways and stuff like that. I feel like, it's just as much as kind of this genre as like kind of the different martial arts. Like kind of revenge is something that is, I don't know, for some reason, like one of the most central kind of themes that seems to come up again and again.
And it's not just kind of revenge on one person, it's kind of epic revenge, where one person has to take down an entire kingdom or civilization to become sort of, on equal sort of path. That seems to be, because I guess it's more feasible in a sort of medieval sword and sorcery world for one person to be able to overthrow an entire kingdom, which wouldn't, it's not like someone could go and just take over New York. So yeah, that's it's a theme. I mean, I would say this, one of my favorite mangas is Berserk, and you can see the influence of something like Conan in 82 had on Berserk, which started around the mid 80s as well. But that's another absolutely kind of epic tale of revenge of one person who's been kind of half left for dead, then going and overthrowing increasingly larger enemies. So
yeah, I think you have a great point about like what distinguishes this kind of revenge from, say, something like even Death Wish or the westerns, the kind of similar kind of theme stuff. Because usually with those, it's usually around getting revenge against one person and possibly like a small gang or something like that. But it's not like, we're not storming New York and kind of going after the whole, the Empire State, I guess, in that case.
Yeah. And and it doesn't sort of take place over the entire course of someone's lifetime. That's the other thing that you find with the kind of sword and sorcery genre,
right?
Is that often it will be like it takes them 10 years or 20 years to take revenge, and and that sort of makes the scale that much more impressive. I guess it's because it's not very likely in that you would get bored and do something else in the modern world. You pick up a video game in between. But.
Yeah. So yeah, let's start off with the 1982 one.
Yes.
The original script was actually written by Oliver Stone, who we really haven't talked about. And it's funny, I can't think of many films by him, or like that. Either certainly I don't think he's done any remakes, and then certainly I don't think any of his films have been remade yet and stuff. Certainly he was big in the 80s, and I feel like it's probably. I have a feeling that Hollywood's probably looking at, like, as we talked about before, that 30-year mark. So I imagine we'll probably see some coming up.
They're rubbing their hands, ready to remake, aren't they? Yeah. Natural Born Killers, the rest of them. No, I mean, it's funny you should mention that, because one of the strongest themes in Conan the Barbarian, in my opinion, is this theme of being wary of religious cults or religious extremism is the kind of the overriding message that I got from it. And how, people can be drawn into it and corrupted by it and will blindly follow people. So it doesn't surprise me that Oliver Stone actually wrote it. That seems to be the sort of thing. But that's very surprising, actually, that he wrote this. I didn't know that at all.
Well, the original, but the one that we ended up, seeing on screen was very much, like kind of had changes and stuff like that. Of course, no doubt, influenced by one of our producers who loves these kind of, Dino de Laurentis, and
one of our great production company who we love, the Dino de Laurentis. Yes.
And John Milius, who directed this previously, of course, with Red Dawn. He had put his finishing touches on the script, to kind of be what he wanted, which was what supposedly his big shift was, going away from too much fantasy to be something that seemed to have this kind of more historical feel. That's something that you can imagine, and certainly we see that like, although there's a fantasy element, there is this feeling that like this could have been some time in our kind of ancient history, stuff like that.
Yeah, it does feel quite. I mean, the fantasy magical element is pretty subdued, really. It's mostly just kind of the violence and the sort of ancient culture sort of part that overrides everything. But it feels quite grounded, really, I thought. And this is what we were talking about this before we videoed this, is that I actually remembered this completely differently. I was actually remembering Conan the Destroyer the entire time, and I actually realized, oh, that's the follow-up, and I didn't really remember very much about this one at all.
Well, speaking of which, I feel like that one really structurally is very much the same movie. It's kind of had some different characters and stuff. It had as you mentioned, Olivia Dabo, who was much more memorable as the daughter compared to the daughter we have in this movie and stuff. And like, I think what stands out about this one is certainly, of course, the big baddie. Besides, of course, Arnold being Conan and stuff like that, it's certainly the foil that kind of really stands up against them is James Earl Jones, who normally certainly you and I certainly the most memorable role was him being the voice of Darth Vader. And it's kind of interesting that like, I feel like this is one of the first films that I've seen him in front of the camera. I was like, so that's the man.
Well, he's a great actor.
Phenomenal.
He's not often, I don't know, I don't remember him being the bad guy in lots and lots of movies though. No. And so this is obviously one where, because he was Darth Vader, they thought, yeah, right, we'll just get him in front of the camera and we'll make him the bad guy. But he does a great job, actually. I mean, he's really terrifying in the scene where he basically just kills Conan's parents, or mother, I should say. The steely look as he you think he's going to sort of spare them, and then just looks at the sword, and then to test it out, whips her head off, and then sort of stares at the boy like, yeah. So yeah,
the man was actually apparently a ranger in the army, like kind of during the Korean War, so he's probably seen his action. It's like, I'm sure. So that's probably why, like, even though he has that kind of steeliness and stuff, it's like kind of where it's just simply his presence that like kind of makes it where like the menace, like simply not by him kind of exuding a lot of this kinetic energy. It's just the fact that like you get the sense that like this person does know how to kill.
Yeah, and I think it's very subtle in that he only has it's only a very fleeting scene, and even as when you see him later on, when he's kind of got his cult around him and he's kind of at the head of that and turning into a snake and things like this, he manages to portray a complete shift in the character. You get this idea of a kind of a merciless sort of soldier, and he sort of transforms into this weird prophet-like character towards the end. So yeah, I mean, and again, it's interesting to see in a kind of a context of the time, because this is the 80s. We've now got the kind of we're now into the kind of anti-hero genre, and I think Arnie really typifies this, and this being in 1982 is kind of like one of these early movies along with Terminator and things like this, where we're kind of rooting for the guy who lives in a moral gray area. But even though he's bad, he's basically just focused on survival like any other Generation X person isn't really drawn into any kind of religious order, is just looking for a pragmatic solution, and is trying to take down the prophets, who are false prophets in this case, and sort of leading people astray.
I feel like this is the role that kind of really made him a star. Like up to then, he had some kind of relatively kind of minor roles, but then after this came the Total Recall, like you said, the Terminator, and all the roles that kind of then he really became known for stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you don't know that he has very many speaking lines in this. Some of them are pretty good, though. My favorite being, what is the meaning? They asked him, what's the meaning of life?
That's actually how I thought about starting this movie, or our talk.
to crush your enemies and hear the lamentation of their women. There's another bit to it, but I thought that was just brilliant. So, and but yeah, he doesn't speak much, but I mean, his body does all the speaking for him, basically.
Yeah.
In this movie. But yeah, I mean, you had this, and then 2 years later, you had Conan the Destroyer and Terminator, because I'm pretty certain that was 1984. Yeah, and by 88, 89, you had Total Recall. And
yeah, that was definitely his golden age.
Oh yeah, I mean, there were other tons of stuff he did in between as well. But yeah,
that's absolutely like kind of when he was like kind of basically how he became the meme. Like on The Simpsons, right? They have this character called McBain, and it's absolutely like kind of like that was Arnie in his prime was McBain.
Totally, yeah. I guess Commando as well. Commando came after this, I think. I'm trying to see what year
Predator
that
was another one. Yeah,
of course, Predator. Yeah. Commando was 85, and let's see when Predator was a bit later. I think it was 87, 88. Yeah, 87 was Predator. So every year he was coming out with a blockbuster movie pretty much during the 80s. Yeah. So
and I don't know if we talked about it before, but ironically, that was not like he had already been a millionaire before making these movies and stuff through real estate and everything like that. And that's something I learned from listening to his bio. I absolutely recommend, if you want to really learn about how the governator became who he is, stuff like that. It's absolutely this guy, like kind of who he had already like raised to the bodybuilding world, but that wasn't enough for him, like kind of he had to like kind of financially, really kind of be successful and stuff like that. And then after that, he was like kind of like, okay, now I will be a movie star. Kind of like it just, the guy just did not stop.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of these really interesting people who just has almost unbounded ambition. And you listen to his sort of training ethic in bodybuilding. I mean, he was just there all the time, taking absolutely everything, constantly learning, constantly improving. And and that was reflected in his career as well. He just kept on moving. And I think the other people that you can obviously point to, I mean, I would say Will Smith, funnily enough, even though he's a very controversial person these days, is very similar. I mean, he's just someone who just doesn't stop. He's just constantly going. Tom Cruise, The Rock, all these guys are just constantly like
just this drive that
I
have no doubt that like if it wasn't for the kind of the rule that we have in states that where you have to be an American-born citizen to be president and stuff, I have no doubt he would have ended up, at least running and having a pretty good shot at it and stuff. Because certainly, like being kind of the governator, like kind of, I mean, that was like kind of one of those kind of key stepping, off points and stuff politically and everything. And to do that, like the last kind of actor who became president was, of course, Ronald Reagan, and he was governor of California. So he probably would have that probably would have been his next financial thing, or excuse me, political thing, other than of course the whole controversy around his the scandal with the divorce, stuff like that. So
yes, indeed. Yeah. So obviously, this isn't like he doesn't have very many memorable lines in this, to be honest with you. It's not like the zingy one-liners from a lot of his other stuff, like Commando.
No, that's much later,
but I mean, it's basically you're just kind of bathing in the glory of his physique for the best part of 2 hours, whilst he sort of disembowels people and chops their heads off and stuff. But there's actually quite a lot of, I'm being unfair here. That's kind of what people's impression of Conan is, but actually rewatching it, it's actually it's a bit more thoughtful and slow paced than I remember, actually. I mean, I would say, the whole story of him being this kind of freed slave who then basically has to grow up without his parents and is, for whatever reason, pushing something around for what seems like 10 years. What that device is, nobody knows, but it's obviously very crucial to that society. And then they just start pitting him against other people. And I didn't quite understand why his master set him free. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention enough at that point, but I don't know if you understood why it was that he actually.
Well, I guess the thing was, at a certain point they realized, like kind of we could probably better use his skills in the arena and stuff like that. So that was like the first step, was like kind of and then like with the gladiators. that was a tradition though, that like, a certain point you can win your freedom, like kind of, so that's actually something that's not, I think that's a Milius touch that like, is taken from history where gladiators have won their freedom, like different points and stuff, by simply, winning enough times and everything.
Yeah, I was just unsure if there was a particular plot event that triggered the
No.
milestone. It just seemed like kind of random, to be honest. So,
well, I mean, it was the way they portrayed it was that like, they the owners, I guess, if you will, like kind of realize that, oh, he can be more profitable for us in the arena and stuff, and he was like kind of, he was winning, like, and I feel like this, we'll certainly talk about the remake and kind of like one of the weaknesses and stuff, that like this one you really see him kind of starting off as this kind of like almost Claude, as a fighter and stuff, and then like in the arena he both with just simple brute strength kind of has some skill, and then he's like kind of given this training, like kind of basically it's the his owners kind of investing in him, and so he dominates, and then because he basically makes them so much money that they probably I feel like it's a little bit of this kind of statement of like, well, the guy's made me this much money, kind of I'll set him free, like kind of
that's what it seemed like. He was just like drunk and said, "Oh, go on then, have your freedom, off you go." Yeah, and then of course he runs into I can't remember her name, but
well, that's it's Sandahl Bergman.
Sandahl Bergman,
yeah, and she's interesting in that she was pretty much like a minor character as a and primarily a dancer, and so the reason why like she was kind of hired was because of physicality, like where like as Valeria, she's absolutely kind of like she has like kind of the physicality, and like where there's the strength and stuff, but it's really her grace and like kind of like, and that comes across from dance background. In fact, I guess at one point with an extra like kind of, it was one of those kind of accents and stuff, like it basically sliced through a finger, like it's just that one of those things that would, and like apparently like they took her to hospital, of course, and then like kind of was fine and everything, but like so it was like kind of one of those things where
yeah, and she's quite tall as well, Sandahl Bergman. I think she's almost like 6 foot, so Arnie doesn't look, they almost look quite well matched. But I think what's surprising is that I've never seen her really in anything else, and she's actually very good in it. And she brings a lot of kind of attitude and character to Valeria, I thought.
Yeah, it's funny how I feel like sometimes it's these roles that the people were just made, just basically made to perform and stuff. Because like you said, after that, she really, like doesn't really, you don't see her much else and stuff. I can't think of any other kind of things that like really stands out that like she did play a minor role in Red Sonja, which is kind of like an offshoot of all this. But that's it and stuff.
I always found it strange that in Red Sonja, they had Arnie in it, but he wasn't Conan. He was just some other random. It seems like such an obvious thing, just kind of like have him as Conan, but in like another movie. It doesn't make, now they'd be like building a franchise on that. But back then, they were like, oh, maybe they thought it would steal the limelight from Bridget Nielsen too much. But you got Mac, but I mean, in this, I would say she almost steals the show. It's like her character is much more memorable than Arnie to some degree, and that's not true in Conan the Destroyer. I would say he's much more up, front and center. You got Max von Sydow as King Osric, who's lost his daughter.
And he's one of those actors that was kind of talked into the role in the sense of where, like kind of where this is of course like a relatively minor role for himself, but apparently like his, I guess, son was a fan of the Conan comics and everything like that. So it was like kind of like it's one of those like, and we talked about before where like sometimes with these actors they're willing to take a smaller role because of just simply that it's kind of like prestige, I guess, if you will.
Well, that's one explanation, or either that or Dino de Laurentis just blackmails like Max von Sydow. So that's why he's always in like all of his movies, like in Being the Merciless, in Flash Gordon. I wouldn't put it past the guy. I bet he's got some dirt on Max von Sydow. That's what I'm joking, of course. I think you've got a very forgettable princess in this one who's kind of brainwashed by James Earl Jones and doesn't really have, I can't even remember if she has many speaking parts, really, not much. She's nowhere near as memorable as the princess role by Olivia d'Abo in Destroyer. I think one of the best performances is Cassandra Gaviola as the witch in this, which is also kind of like an interesting kind of take on this. This is this in the 80s. It seemed like if you were doing a fantasy film, one, it had to be very violent. Two, it definitely had to have some naked people in it.
Yes,
and sex was inextricably wound with magic somehow. If you were going to have sex with someone, chances are they would be a witch, and some sort of curse would befall you as a result. So this is very much, and that it reminds me a lot of like Excalibur, if you remember that movie. That was another one where it was like, there was lots of sort of weird sex that involved people turning into dragons and things like this.
Right.
So that was a good scene.
Certainly her looks didn't go to waste, because Cassandra Gaviola, she was also on the cover of the memorable cover of Jefferson Starship album Spitfire. It's the one with the dragons and like that, and the smoking girl. That's her.
And, right.
And she's relatively like in terms of acting though, unfortunately, she's only gotten other minor roles, but she did end up as the barmaid in Last Man Standing, which we talked about with the Yojibo series.
That's right. Yes. Okay. Yeah, it's been that's quite a break, isn't it? Because there wasn't much else big movies that she was in between that, I don't think. There was also, I think Mako. Mako as the wizard. He was actually very cool as the wizard. He's one of those guys that just
you see him all over the place. All over. He was like kind of the go-to when they needed like an Asian kind of
eccentric Asian character, basically is his speciality, isn't it? I'm trying to see what else he's been in, but the list will be, I'm sure, long.
Definitely. Like if just any kind of movie like Pearl Harbor or whatever at the time that they were making, he was no doubt in it.
He was Splinter in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Right.
Yeah, Memories of a
in the animated version.
Yes, it's a long list. But
the two other worth mentioning is William Smith, who was actually in Red Dawn as well as the colonel, the Russian colonel and stuff like that. And the Jerry Lopez, what's worth mentioning is he was just a surfer buddy of John Milius, and he just like kind of like basically you look like you'd be getting this role stuff, and then and he's another one of those kind of actors like didn't have much else after that, but this was like the role that was made for him and stuff. And apparently like John Milius was kind of, as a surfer, was known as Viking Man and stuff, because he had this kind of passion for things kind of Norse and medieval and stuff.
right. The one we shouldn't forget, of course, it has another bodybuilder, has Franco Colombo as the scout for the Serpent folks as well. Who has a sort of a one-on-one fight. So it's pretty cool to see these two legends of bodybuilding sort of duking it out. I mean, it's quite a strange sort of story, really, in a way, in that there's this serpent, and I mean, I'm sure conspiracy theorists light bulbs will be going off. There is a serpent cult where they worship snakes, and he somehow uses it looks like the corpses of people that he's either killed into a big cauldron, and they eat this to somehow sustain them. And
it does very much sound like the things lately we've been hearing about, the conspiracies around this kind of pedophile kind of society, whatever and stuff, and reptilian kind of aliens.
Yes, reptilian aliens. And of course, it's the royal families that they're indoctrinating into their cult to spread their power of their thing. I mean, it's quite funny just to see. I mean, it obviously is a statement on hippie culture, because there's all these guys with flowers all sort of lining up to join the cult, and Arnie goes, "You got some flowers, okay?" And so it's obviously this kind of sort of disillusionment with any kind of counterculture stuff that's gone on. It's now like every man for himself. It's the 80s. You brute strength and body beautiful wins, basically, is the kind of the message I get from Conan.
It hints at the kind of hypocrisy too of the priesthood, though, because the one priest, like, kind of, it seems like he's kind of has his homosexual agenda, that kind of, where he kind of tries to lead Arnie off to some me time, I guess, and stuff.
That's right. Arnie swiftly puts him down, yeah. I mean, it's a very kind of it's the kind of anti-hero survivor might versus right kind of approach. It's hard to, I mean, it's funny in a way, this movie almost is more about Arnie and bodybuilding at the time than it is actually about the story in a way. I mean, you had Jane Fonda's Workout was kind of like the best-selling VHS tape of that year, and I think it was kind of when, I mean, I distinctly remember the 80s as being this time when people became obsessed with like body beautiful and tanning,
that's true.
And and this kind of typical, this kind of because it's 1982, isn't it? This really did sort of like meet that trend as it started, really.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying is so true, because around that time, that movie Perfect came out, and also, which we also had American Psycho, right, and stuff. It's kind of these films that basically just capture that theme of, like you said, where it's very much about the image and stuff.
Well, I mean, American Psycho, the book, came out in the early 90s, and that was kind of a comment on the 80s. And then the movie was, a bit after that. But I would say, I mean, you did have, I'm trying to remember what when it came out, but you had 10 with Dudley Moore, that was basically just 1981 was 10, which was basically a movie about a guy searching for physical perfection in women, more or less. So it was definitely like a very prominent theme all the way through. And I think it was when, I think the late 70s was really when the steroids started flowing in bodybuilding, or maybe even before that. And the 80s was just like they kicked it up a whole other notch. And I guess it was when you also got kind of professional wrestling really became, I mean, I don't know, was that later? When did the WWF really start kicking off? Maybe 90s, really, wasn't it, perhaps?
No, I do remember it kind of being a huge thing in the 80s. I mean, I personally wasn't.
I mean, Hulk Hogan and.
Yeah, I personally wasn't into it, but I definitely remember, my friends talking about it and going to these matches, like kind of like, so you had this kind of like thing where, and that other movie recently captured it, that like you have like kind of the more local, if you will, like the across town there would be like kind of some local kind of match that would, with like unknowns and stuff like that, but then they would like kind of be climbing this supposed ladder, right? Because it's and that's the thing that I have to admit, that's what I still don't get about professional wrestling, is that on the one hand there's like competition, but the other, it is very much scripted, which like kind of that film, I have to remember the film that I'm making. Let's see here.
Well, whilst you're looking at that, also mentioned that this was really the rise of plastic surgery as well. The 80s was really when you started getting a lot of more celebrities and various other people getting involved in altering themselves. So it became, and this is why I think this is the rise of body horror during the 80s, because on one hand you had people were really trying to augment themselves, and you had the potential dangers of that expressed in the horror movies.
Definitely. Let's see here. Fighting with My Family, where the Rock, Dwayne Johnson plays himself, and then it's kind of stars Florence Pugh as this gal whose family's like like her the family kind of performs as like kind of what's called as professional wrestlers and stuff, and then she kind of somehow wins a shot at the big time to join WWE and everything like that.
Gotcha. Yeah.
It's really, even though it's like kind of a comedy and spoof and stuff like that, and it's fictional, but it really, I think, captures this idea though that like there's this kind of mix of like fiction to it, but yet there's like very much a certain physicality competition, I guess, or like where like you have to still be able to kind of do certain things because like if you can't so even though like it's not you actually like kind of winning in one sense, but like if you're not able to kind of perform at a certain level, then you're not going to ever like kind of rise to like be a champion, stuff like that. It's a really kind of I don't, to be again, I don't really get it, but I do understand that like it's like kind of that it's this kind of mix of fiction and I guess reality.
Sounds good, actually. I'll have to check it out. Not seen that one. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting kind of 80s movie. Feels very typically 80s, really, even though it's very early on, and it's quite slow for an 80s movie, I would say. There's lots of bits of him thoughtfully trying to be train or survive, and then there's the weird scene with him where he kind of gets crucified and then gets brought back to life by the wizard.
Yeah.
Which takes quite a long time from what I remember. And it's quite an interesting look for Arnie to have all that weird sort of stuff over his face.
Right. Yeah. I think it really capitalizes also on this idea of like, the Valeria character, she's, like kind of just not, like she's on the one hand, this companion or like that, and equal, but she really cares for Conan, and so she kind of basically makes a deal with the devil, so to speak, like kind of willing to kind of like say, like, hey, kind of what's called I'll give whatever it takes, kind of just make him live in there like that, and knock on wood, or spoilers, that she ends up actually, of course, being sacrificed, and it feels like that she's because like she had to pay the price, ultimately. But oddly enough, she comes back as this kind of Valkyrie, like kind of like looking very much like the Valkyrie from Battle Beyond the Stars, actually.
That's exactly what I was about to say as well. I just thought, this is a cameo from Battle Beyond, but yeah, no, that's quite an interesting a bit, isn't it? I think it's Franco Columbo. She blinds, if I remember correctly, but yeah, maybe not. Yeah. So any more thoughts on the original? It's not a terribly deep film, to be fair.
No. I feel like the other thing that kind of worth mentioning is how it really capitalized on the rise of fantasy in that time period. Like the 80s was another. We've talked about it before with Hawk the Slayer, and it just kind of like just really hit on this like burning I don't know, desire for like for me personally, I was really into D&D at the time and stuff, and it just kind of like was just the film I wanted to see at that time.
Yeah, I do wonder what that was. I think it was kind of the 70s seemed to be very obsessed with real threats, and then the 80s was much more escapist. And I think it was also to do with the improvements in visual effects, which looking back now, you may look back and think, oh, well, they're not that good. But I mean, there was quite a major jump in the quality of effects in 80s movies compared to 70s, I would say. I mean, Star Wars was really the groundbreaker with that. But I think that kind of like, that I think in many respects sort of opened the eyes of the studios, thinking, oh, we can do really, epic kind of fantasy stories. And I don't think it actually mattered that it was superheroes, space, fantasy, anything like that. They were just like, oh, the audiences really want this. And I mean, yeah, you had loads. You had what, Beastmaster, Krull, Hawk the Slayer, Excalibur on a more sort of serious sort of note. And there was a lot of movies like that came out.
And it was also, like a great summertime kind of movie, right? Like
Yeah.
it was the whole idea of also like these blockbusters, like kind of, and sci-fi and fantasy, like kind of were just absolutely the kind of films that like, got the nerds out in full force and stuff.
And I think it may have a sort of a more sort of political backdrop. And I think people were very cynical, but it seemed like in a way, I think people were just sort of more resigned to the fact that Reagan was kind of in charge, and it was kind of, we were in the Cold War, but we're basically just sort of, this is just America first, and off we go. And same in England, we had Margaret Thatcher, who was just kind of running the show through most of the 80s, and
Right.
the Iron Lady, and it was, similar but not quite the same. But yeah,
I think it's just like the thing we talked about with the 30s, that like fantasy sci-fi was like the bit of escapism from the fact that like the threat of mushroom clouds coming over the horizons and like that.
Well, I don't think we felt very threatened during the 80s, to be honest with you.
Really?
I think no, not really. I mean, there was the Cold War, but nothing ever seemed to sort of happen, I think. So people just kind of felt there was more room for the escapism. I don't think it was like people, trying to escape the depression like in the 30s in that respect.
It's maybe escape isn't the right word, but just kind of forget about it, because I feel like even though like it wasn't like that imminent kind of danger, but you did always kind of like, in the back of your mind kind of like wonder, when was like I'm trying to remember that one film that really captured it, days the day, not the day after, but it was some film that was like kind of just this just basically, where they actually showed like, the missiles launching and the mushroom clouds and all that kind of stuff. But it just at least here in the States, that was like kind of, as a kid, stuff like that, you kind of wondered like, kind of, are they going to be dropping the big one and stuff like that? And it was like, it was just always kind of present. It wasn't like kind of, it probably wasn't like in Kennedy era where like, you thought like any second, like kind of, but it was just like kind of cynicism that like, you wondered like, whether, like kind of, will next year be it and stuff like that.
No, I think it was definitely there as a threat, but it seemed very distant, I think, from my perspective. But yes. I mean, it's funny because it dates me back to talking to someone about 9/11 when I was traveling in America in 2005, I want to say. And people described it as, they were kind of my age, and they described it like we grew up kind of in a bubble almost. And it felt like when 9/11 happened, it was like, oh, all of a sudden someone from outside the country could have come in and can actually affect us. And so I think the 80s and the 90s to some degree sort of represent that kind of idea of like the threats are kind of distant, but we're kind of okay in a way.
It was like, just like kind of, I feel like that's why it's this kind of cynicism, and where that like on one hand you had things like Trivial Pursuit, like that was for some reason like like just about every home had a copy of that game. And I used to joke that like it was the age of trivia, that kind of that where people had these distractions and stuff that like besides of course drugs and all that kind of stuff, that like where we just had plenty of things that kind of were almost like pushing off or not dealing with like kind of these realities and stuff, like stagflation, all that kind of stuff. It's like it was all there, but like kind of as long as kind of we had these distractions, we were fine and stuff like that. And where it was imminent, but like but it's still just beyond the horizon, so it's not really a threat and stuff like that. I feel like that was like kind of just a general sense, and it would kind of like showed up also as like kind of besides this kind of thirst for fantasy, but also like where these kind of films like started having these kind of more cynical views, like the one that you and I've talked about is the one by John Carpenter, They Live, and where kind of like there's this feeling that like you're being told to consume, and you're told you kind of like like these are the things, of trappings of success and stuff, but Day of the Dead was like another one where like, or Dawn of the Dead, it was like kind of this, but in reality something feels off, kind of like something's just can possibly just in a second everything can change and stuff.
Well, I think the difference was in the 60s and the 70s, this idea that, you were being manipulated and stuff was kind of quite cutting edge. Where when you got to the 80s, it was almost like, well, this is just everyone accepts this now. But it was kind of like the truth that was just then over there as the backdrop. So yeah, in a way. I mean, the other thing that I've noticed as well, a big difference between 80s and 90s movies and afterwards is that the heroes, if there's an alien invasion or stuff like that, it can almost always be sort of fended off by a group of kids or like a group of ragtag heroes. Whereas anything post 9/11, it's like the army has to be involved. We've got to call in all the forces, and it's got to be all sort of very militaristic. So I guess
the 80s was absolutely like kind of where we didn't trust the army or
no, absolutely, no. Because they were like war games, they might start a thermonuclear war or something. I guess that's
or like they were really like just really corrupt themselves, like kind of like Day of the Dead, where you know the actual military, it's like any second we're going to turn on us and stuff.
Indeed. So I guess unless we've got anything else, we went down a bit of a rabbit hole there. So I guess we should move on to the 2011.
I guess we're putting it off a little bit.
The Jason Momoa vehicle, Conan the Barbarian, riding on the success, I assume, of him as being Drogo from Game of Thrones. They figured, he's popular. Let's try and rehash another kind of ancient fantasy franchise with him in the helm.
Yeah, I feel like that was kind of right away their first mistake was like basically that like expecting him to carry the movie, because certainly like you had like some talent on this cast and stuff. Like ironically again, Ron Perlman shows up as another minor character. It's like kind of it seems like that's his thing, like kind of beyond like his own success in other series and stuff like that that is dedicated with them. Rachel Nichols is actually a J.J. Abrams kind of product, if you will. She gained some success on Alias, and then and she's kind of had some success on like kind of on her own stuff, but on this film it's just wasted, kind of along with Bruce McGowan's another one that like you had like fairly talented kind of, and then Morgan Freeman narrating stuff, but it's all gone to waste.
Yeah, and I do like Stephen Lang, I want to say, is the bad guy. I mean Stephen Lang's a great actor, but well, maybe not great. Maybe I'm being good.
I mean, he's really good in Don't Breathe. I mean, if you want to see one film that really uses his talent, he's really good in that.
Yeah, I liked him in Avatar as well. I thought he was really good at the band.
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
And you got, of course, Rose McGowan as his kind of slightly twisted daughter.
He was actually in Manhunter too. That's what I didn't realize. I forget and stuff.
Oh, he was.
Yeah, he was Freddy, the what's called the actor that is hungry for the story and stuff like that.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
I'd really forgotten. Didn't recognize him at all.
No, he's one of those character actors, like like very much like kind of Gary Oldman, that he can be very much a chameleon and stuff, and just kind of morph into these different roles.
Yeah. Now, sort of 2011, Rose McGowan has been in various kind of Robert Rodriguez movies and various other things. So she's kind of like somebody. I mean, I guess the idea with this is that they must have thought, okay, Conan's a kind of a pulpy kind of B-movie sort of style thing. Maybe we can ride some of the kind of cool kudos of Tarantino and redo this. The problem being that they didn't do it anywhere near as well as he would have done it, or used any of that style. It's just a very straightforward kind of, almost trying to be a sort of superhero action movie, but with more naked people in.
I mean, the director has been involved apparently with different kind of high profile remakes. Like we'll probably talk about him again in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So like he has some credentials and stuff, but I think that's what we'll probably see in that film too. That like there's certainly like it doesn't feel like there's much of a, you know, fingerprint or thumbprint of as to, you know, like why, like kind of, you know, um why was he, what was he trying to do with the film and stuff, you know, like kind of.
Yeah. But it's a kind of a similar setup, you know, bad guy rolls into town, kills his parents, and within a very elaborate way, though. I mean, there's a bucket of molten lava, and he has to somehow keep the chain balanced, and that's all kind of a bit. I mean, wouldn't you just kind of, couldn't you have got a knife and just cut the ties with the other hand? And I can't remember if he was chained or tied, but it seemed like they made it far more difficult than it needed to be honest, that whole sequence.
And I feel like the bigger issue is that, like, this trend of where the you know, the hero as a kid already was like magically gifted with these talents and stuff. Like, in other words, you know, like kind of, you know, there was this competition, right, with the other kids and stuff. And somehow, because he's Conan, he's, you know, has these magical talents.
Yeah.
It's
can
just
somehow fend off 6 adults, you know? And it's like, I won't go into details, but I have sort of, through boxing training, ended up boxing with kids that I was defending only at the end. The point of the exercise was to get me to dodge more quickly. And I can tell you this much, there's just no chance. There's just no chance that he would have been able to do that. And of course, he does it without breaking the egg, and, you know, to show just how amazing he was. Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's kind of, I don't know why people think this is a good idea to try and already show people that, you know, because the thing is, you have no journey. If he's already that talented when he's like 10, then you don't care about the rest of the journey. You just assume, well, yeah, he's obviously going to be like hard as nails, doesn't need any help from anyone.
But that's such a trend of these, you know, genre movies lately, you know, like kind of whether it's the Star Wars franchise or, you know, like kind of the, you know, like everyone's kind of, or superhero movies, another one that, like, you know, which, okay, to some degree, you know, that is a kind of a typical kind of thing we see with hero movies in general, but at least like there's at least some journey and stuff. Like Spider-Man at least kind of slowly kind of, you know, evolves in his skills and stuff.
But that's not the point of them. The point of them is that you have these new abilities, but you then have the struggle, the conflict of trying to balance that with a normal life. That's the kind of thing, the interesting part of the journey with superheroes. Not like, oh, I've got like loads of powers, off we go and fight evil. It's like there's nothing to that. There's what's the point in running that? So then we also have like a very obvious trend in post 2000s movies, in that they've started basically becoming video games. In that the bad guys have to, for whatever reason, have to collect pieces of a mask that are scattered all around, so they can put it all together, so they can do this thing, which is just like they went on their own little Legend of Zelda quest whilst he's growing up. But then they also need some pure blood as well, so they can. And I hate this when they have this whole thing where it takes characters 20 years to assemble the mask, to find the pure blood person. Then they resurrect them, and basically, like, they're dead. They die instantly. It's like it's kind of like the Ghostbusters thing. It's kind of like you do all this to become mortal, and then you just get blown away. It's kind of, what's the point in that? So so for whatever reason, we have them collecting a piece of a mask, which all fit together very easily.
Yes, of course.
You know, it's like someone's really designed this mask well when they broke it up. They've obviously notched and carved all the bits in so that it just clicks into place very satisfyingly.
No super glue needed.
No, none whatsoever, you know, because that would in itself is like, you just had to say, well, it's magic engineering, because we don't have super glue. And I mean, the thing is, he has this daughter who can somehow read people's minds, detect whether they're pure bloods, can sort of magically have all these powers, but yet is fairly useless for the best part of 20 years, it seems. You just think, you know, wouldn't she have been able to figure this out a little more easily?
And there's a bit of a Oedipus kind of weird thing too, that you know, like, because, you know, she's trying to be the mother, or just like the mother. In fact, you know, kind of, why don't you just pick me? Kind of, you know, like forget the mother.
I know, right? Yeah, because of course when you're involved with evil powers, you lose all moral grounding, I guess. So yeah. And she can conjure warriors out of sand,
Right,
which is very handy as well.
Yes.
She doesn't do that at the finale when they really could have used about another 6 more people to help out, but she can only do it for whatever reason that once in that scene when we're kind of halfway through the 2-hour period and we need someone to fill in some storyline gaps. Yeah. This whole thing of the they had to introduce the whole pure blood thing to get Rachel Nichols in there to have some kind of love interest, I guess. But there's not much else to it really than that. And then of course it's not just, we go through this whole thing of they're chasing her and blah blah blah, and she's got to escape and then she's got to get back, and they use like a little drop of blood. It's like, why didn't they just take that when they first got her, put her in a little test tube and say like, that's right, you're fine, on your way. Again, it's one of those really silly things where it was like, if this was an 80s movie, we're in Temple of Doom territory, she would have a throat cut and she'd be gone at that point. If they needed blood, you would get blood in an 80s movie. It'd be
like a splurge of
but there's quite a lot of CGI blood in this, which is quite, it feels almost like kind of like a CGI sort of anime or something like this, where they've just added lots of extra blood for visual effect, but it feels a bit over the top really. And there's lots of sort of death scenes where people get stabbed through the face and things like this. It's kind of like, it's almost like they've tried to sort of blend Hostel with the original kind of, it's got a kind of a bit of a sort of torture porn element to it, I would say, which is, and again, another kind of 2000s trend.
Yes. Yeah, it's funny, like we've seen this in some of the different films that like they do like kind of use the certain elements that are in vogue, I guess, if you will. And then, like you said, around that time, that kind of more graphic violence seemed to be more, in kind of in favor. Because certainly other times it'd be like kind of, they would try to tone it down to kind of, appease the censors and stuff like that. But here, like, they were having at it.
It just felt like they kind of did, we'll just have Khal Drogo. It's the Khal Drogo show, 2 hours basically, without the beard.
Yes.
Yeah. It's fairly forgettable. It had very little impact on the world at large, it seems. I don't actually know if it made any money. That's actually one thing.
I think it actually lost.
Not surprising really.
But luckily it didn't, kind of sideline, Jason Momoa's career too much, because certainly after that, he became Aquaman, and that certainly kind of brought him to the forefront even more and stuff.
I think it's one of those things. It's hard to not like Jason Momoa. That's the thing. He's one of those characters that, or he's one of those actors that basically, more or less, you just feel he plays himself. But that's kind of, he's quite a charismatic person, so that's fine.
Definitely. In all fairness, the movie with the different problems and stuff, I do feel like in terms of casting, it's certainly, with a better script and better kind of, just a better film overall, I feel like there was the possibility that like in other words, I feel like he certainly was more than serviceable in the role. He kind of like, did the best he could with what he was working with, I think.
It was serviceable. The whole thing is, it's just a very boring plot, really. It's very unimaginative. There's nothing, I hate to say unexpected, because, we all know how badly wrong that can go. But it just, the entire premise should have been a little bit more original and thought out better. Basically, you should have just given it to like Robert Rodriguez to do. They should have just said, here you go, do Conan. And it would have been great.
Yeah, apparently, like the Conan estate, or the estate that owned the rights and stuff like that, basically, like they really I mean, this was not what they apparently signed up for, or stuff like that. But apparently, by that point, the rights were already, in the hands of the studio and all that kind of stuff. So,
yeah.
So unfortunately, it is what it is. I
mean, well, yeah. I mean, I guess it's one of those things, isn't it? You could. How do you even navigate things like this if you're the sort of custodian of a particular estate? It's like the Lord of the Rings show on Netflix, I'm sure. And I know people who are in the Tolkien Society, and like, man, this is just, why? But like, how do you, what sort of caveats do you put in? And you say, okay, like, we have to have script approval, or no studio is going to sign off on you having like first, say watch the movie and they say, oh no, it's terrible, scrap it.
Right. Yeah, because it just, like you said, I mean, that's exactly it. That it gets too hard, because like, I mean, what studio wants to like kind of have that kind of hassle, in terms of dealing with, kind of the whims of, like kind of people that in theory aren't filmmakers and stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that's one thing we haven't really talked about, is the fact that this does tie in with our theme of 1930s sort of comics. And I guess the original idea of the comics was, like we've often talked about your take on the 1930s, and that there was this interest in exotica, so to speak, and traveling to new locations and finding, hidden sort of mysteries abroad in various places. And I kind of feel that's the same kind of escapism that would have been behind the original idea of the comic when that came out, was this idea of, what actually drove these ancient societies, or what would have happened.
And that absolutely gets into, the original author, Robert E. Howard, because here's this kind of kid, actually, like actually a lot of these stories he wrote like kind of apparently in his teenhood, stuff like that like, they weren't fully formed at that point, but like he kind of wrote kind of the basis of it, in different forms, different characters and stuff like that. But then that ultimately ended up, what he did, as he was older in his life, like kind of in his 20s and stuff. And the guy, like, was, living in a small town, Texas, during the oil boom and stuff. And it was absolutely like kind of somebody who, like, the reality around him was not exactly the, the glamorous, kind of city life and stuff. So he definitely dreamed of like kind of, these different places that he read about and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it does make you wonder sort of what drove this, because it's quite a strange idea to put into I mean, it doesn't seem strange now, but I'm sure at the time when you had detective comics and that being all the rage, that someone who just came along and wrote something about, medieval or prehistory warriors. I don't think they were particularly magical, from what my impression of reading some of the sort of outlines of the stories. But it obviously captured people's imagination at the time, and it was pretty successful. But there's a big gap, because I mean, I think they published quite a few in the 30s, and then I think they kind of redid it in the 70s, from what I remember from reading of the timeline. And it wasn't continuous like Dick Tracy or Batman and things like this. There was a big sort of hiatus in between. So it's interesting that, well, it may have just been that it was a character they already had, and they could just kind of spin it up in the 70s without too much difficulty. But it does make there's a lot of questions for me as to why this was, first of all, he even came up with this as a storyline in the 30s, and why it came back in the 70s. And obviously it was popular enough as a comic for them to think, okay, we can make this into a movie circa 82, because they probably would have been talking about it, I guess, late 70s, early 80s.
I think it had a lot to do with like kind of how the rights were just passed around and stuff. Because he actually, the guy, killed himself, and like kind of at the age of like 30 something.
Really?
Yeah, and so and then like they really didn't have a family to kind of pass it on to and stuff. So like I don't know the full details about kind of the rights in the estate, stuff like that, but basically. After that, it was just kind of bounce around from, different folks that somehow owned it and stuff like that. I guess there was like a foundation that kind of actually, I guess, that apparently is like a lot of what the ownership kind of, so it seems like for the most part, yeah, like the stuff just kind of was just, basically passed around, and then, like, I think partially what really brought it back to quite a degree was the artwork of Frank Frazetta, that really visually showed like kind of, like Conan stuff. Like I think if it wasn't for that, it probably just wouldn't have had the same impact. I think it was just, and Frank Frazetta, to be honest, I just know of the art, or just I've seen the work and stuff like that. I don't know much about like kind of how that, the connection, I guess, if you will.
Yeah, I think what was hard to appreciate these days is the fact that there weren't really dedicated comic book shops, and fantasy artwork wasn't something that you would actually see that often.
No.
And I have very sort of clear memories of going to bookshops, and in the sci-fi and fantasy section, you would see all this incredible artwork on the covers of sort of sci-fi movies or fantasy novels, and that was really where, I mean, that was part of the appeal, was really just that artwork really kind of got your imagination working before you even read the story. And it's very distinctive as well. It's a bit like heavy metal album covers of the 80s as well, which also have very sort of very detailed graphic styles, like Iron Maiden's album covers are like, with Eddie, are just so sort of iconic. But that there was a lot of that, that's very reminiscent of a lot of the sci-fi and fantasy of the time, of that style.
Yeah, I feel like that just kind of was just the timing thing that, like, between, we talked about kind of the rise of D&D and stuff like that, and then just like kind of the films. It's kind of, I think they all kind of fed into each other, that like there was this combination of like kind of, we started really thirsting for, kind of this kind of thing. And Frazetta was like the right artist at the right time and stuff.
Yeah. Also makes you think about, like, Dino de Laurentis was pretty ahead of his time, really, and he kind of almost preempted a lot of the comic book and superhero trends of the 2000s, almost 20 years ahead of that, because he had this, Flash Gordon.
Yeah.
I'm sure he did others as well, but yeah. Yeah,
he definitely, kind of knew his market, I guess, so to speak, and definitely knew how to, fan the fires once, he caught on to
more ways than one, from what I've heard. But yeah, leaving his mark. Anyway, going into that, you'd have to check our earlier videos to see the full story.
Yes.
But no, I mean, it's so I don't know. We've kind of veered away from the 2011 remake because it was quite dull. Any final thoughts on it at all, or?
I think, just in terms of the future, if you will, I think they were trying to capitalize, like I said, besides Jason Momoa, was also like kind of the Game of Thrones kind of trend that, like kind of, I think 2011 was like when things were really at its peak and stuff, where they seemed to be audience hungry for, the fantasy genre again and stuff. But unfortunately, this was left you wanting a lot more and stuff.
Well, yeah, the difference being that Game of Thrones is really well written and has interesting plot points, and is written from a very interesting perspective. I don't really, as I say, aside from giving it to Robert Rodriguez, I mean, they did do a TV show of Conan as well, which we didn't really cover in this.
No.
But I don't think that was particularly exciting. I did watch some of it, I think, when it was around, but again, not really the time and the place for Conan, I don't think, which was the 90s, I believe. Will they do it again? Yes, I'm sure they will. And hopefully they'll do, I think for me, I think you need to take some pages out of Berserk or something like that, having a real absolute kind of tragic fantasy that's really, really dark and twisted. And I think then you could really do Conan justice. I think that would probably work. Would it work at this period of time? I don't think so. I think it might take a little while, a few more generational shifts before that could become a possibility. But it'll come back at some stage.
And where would you say, like, kind of Conan like kind of fits into like the whole landscape for like the 30s comics and or like kind of like the superhero things and stuff. Like what do you think, what does it kind of feel that like the Batmans, the Superman and all that kind of stuff doesn't and stuff, besides fantasy, of course, the obviously.
Yeah, it's odd because I don't know enough about the comic, but I mean, it seems like a lot of the way, actually the appeal of these comics in the 30s was that actually it was a way to exercise a kind of graphic violence. Dick Tracy is, like we've talked about, like he's a very kind of upstanding moral person who's always right and always does the right thing, but it's really an excuse for him to blow away these awful bad guys who are kind of like killing women and doing all sorts of horrible things. And I kind of feel that was part of the appeal of these comics, was that there were these really morally reprehensible people contrasted with your main hero, who is sort of like morally incorruptible. And it may be that this was their way with Conan. Maybe in the comics, Conan was a very kind of righteous person, but he was there sort of beheading people and disemboweling them, because it was their way of like appealing to people's kind of shock value or that kind of thing in the comics. So I would imagine it's that way. It's that way of kind of like subtly publishing really violent stories that will kind of hook people in, right. Without it being overt. That seems to be the kind of trend or the main reason you would watch these things. It's a bit kind of like the pre-code movies of the 30s, and that it was some of them are kind of like a little bit of an excuse just to have a bit of titillation and people peeking in on women getting changed and things like this. Well, a monster ravages them or something like this. It's kind of similar kind of thing. I think sex and violence, it's always a perennial seller, just in different forms. But I think that's true. But I don't know that it really had a you can kind of see how Dick Tracy evolved into Batman, and you can kind of see how Superman evolved into other kind of superhero stories, along with Flash Gordon and other people of that era. But I don't know that you can really see that with Conan. I can't think of like a 40s, 50s, or even 60s character. No. Closest I can think of is like Thor in Marvel, but even that's really not. It's just maybe kind of somewhat similar, but not really.
I feel like this is similar to the John Carter character, who unfortunately that's another movie that kind of just didn't go anywhere. Because because of execution. But I feel like each of these have the potential for something like a character who's more physical, and like you said, that like that it's got to be done in such a way that does involve the sexiness and stuff like that, but also there's got to be something more. It's got to be much better writing, that it's not just because the original, like by no means the 1982 is by no means a perfect film and stuff, but it's really watchable in the sense of where like just some of the physical sequences, right, like the raid on the temple and stuff, just like these moments where like some hack and slash that's like kind of it's enjoyable, kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of a bit of a sort of action adventure romp, really, isn't it, with a bit of magic thrown in.
I feel like the other aspect of him being a thief, like versus like a hero in the true sense and stuff, it makes it interesting that like he's kind of would rather just simply get like lots of treasure and then like go and wine and dine, like kind of at the end of the day and stuff. I think that makes it interesting, like kind of that he's not a knight or something like that, like kind of where he's trying to do it for honor or anything. He's doing it just to have wine and women. I think that makes him interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be interesting to know, if you read the comics of the 30s and the 70s, sort of I imagine the 70s was much more the kind of wine and women anti-hero character compared to the 30s, but I could be wrong. But it'd be interesting to compare how they're portrayed.
Cool. So coming up, Batman is imminent stuff, and then what about like in the meanwhile, what do you what are your thoughts on the next watch, I guess, in between Batman or
Next watch. I mean, we could try and. I mean, we've done a lot of the 30s sort of comic books. I'm trying to think
yes.
if Flash Gordon would be. We could throw that in there, but there hasn't really been a remake. So
Yeah, that's. I mean, it had a series for a while, and stuff, but
yeah,
it's definitely hardly kind of worth mentioning or hardly worth diving into as much. We could possibly, like on a related note, start exploring into the manga, which we've talked about for ages
yes.
and stuff.
Yeah, I know.
So
Yep. Well, I've always wanted to. I think Attack on Titan is a really interesting
Okay.
one. It's almost finished. It's only about 9 episodes away from finishing. Unfortunately, you'll have to wait another year for those 9 episodes to come out. But
Death Note.
that's an interesting one. Your Death Note's also a very good one.
Okay.
We could
And then
definitely do Death Note.
what was the Scarlett Johansson?
Oh yeah, was Ghost in the Shell. She did that
Ghost in
one,
the Shell.
didn't she?
Yeah. So that'd be
Yeah.
another one that'd be worth, I think, diving into. So
Absolutely.
okay.
Sounds good.
So until next time, John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we'll see you at the movies.